I think that the catechism today has ample opportunity for catechists to really engage like the burning questions that people have, but they come at it asking questions about here, like what about gender dysphoria or something like that? What does the church teach about that? And you're like, all right, I see your question, and I'm gonna meet you there, but I'm actually going to take this back to the ground level, which is the doctrine of creation. So what is a creature? Or it says, let's talk about this at the level of a foundation. Let's see what's underlying those kinds of questions, and it is able to address them on that level. Oh, what you're doing here and sort of resetting the foundations is actually incredibly radical thing to do. It's like, oh, this is actually all there in the in the creed, in the Lord's Prayer, in the Ten Commandments. There's actually a quite a radical vision for human life and goodness and flourishing and everything else.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Anglican Renaissance podcast. This is on the Young Anglican channel. My name is Joe. I have a guest today, Dr. Alex Fogleman. Without further ado, would you like to introduce yourself, Alex?
Yeah, thank you. It's good to be here. I'm Alex Fogleman. I have a couple of different roles within Anglican worlds. I'm primarily right now work at Baylor University. I did my doctoral work here at Baylor, and then I work here at the Institute for Studies of Religion. Next year, though, I'll be starting a new position at Trinity Anglican Seminary. And I also direct the Committee for Catechesis, or the Catechesis Task Force for the ACNA. And most of my sort of writing and speaking and working with churches revolves around the area of catechesis, which I suspect we'll talk about today.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of the people in my audience who are, especially the ones who are new to Anglicanism, are interested in the idea of catechesis, especially the ones who are in the ACNA and just saw that recently the app version of the ACNA Catechism was just released. For when we're recording this, it was yesterday, I think, that the app was like officially released. I got the like early thing because I was at Provincial Assembly when when that happened. That was the first place that I think I saw you, was the lecture you gave at Provincial Assembly on it, which I thought was super great. I think catechesis in our time is probably one of those weird areas where a lot of Christians aren't used to it anymore. It's not really as emphasized in different Christian traditions, especially not as much as it used to be. But as I'm sure we'll get into, catechesis, catechisms have a huge history, especially in Western Christianity. That will be interesting to dissect. But the ACNA, Anglican Church North America, which we're both part of, is just released a catechism a couple years ago, and now there's an app which you can follow along with, which I would totally recommend. And you were involved in doing that, which I think is super, super cool. So for those who don't know what a catechism is, it's kind of a weird word, catechism. It's not, you don't really use that in secular life as much. So what is a catechism?
Yeah, good. A catechism is a teaching tool, basically. And the form that we know them in often use this kind of question and answer model. And that kind of model, that format, is based. It's sort of ancient roots go back to the Socratic method. It's a way of doing teaching and learning through dialogue. And so the format of a catechism is a text version of a dialogue. So catechesis is always intended to be a relational exercise between a kind of teacher and student. A catechist, it would be the technical term for a teacher, and then a catechumen would be the term for a learner. And all of these are rooted in this, it's a Greek word, katekeo. It appears, I think, 5 times in the New Testament. And it basically, its original context, it just means teaching. So it's often just translated as teaching or learning or being taught, being instructed. And then in the early church, it developed into this more technical sense of sort of instruction, usually around baptism. So it's sort of originally was teaching in the context of baptism. So preparing new people for baptism. Those people were called catechumens, and they were semi-official, like part of the church. Like, I just think of it like you could be martyred for being a catechumen, but you were not yet baptized. So it's this interesting sort of place in the church. And then so there's all this sort of guidance around this process. Well, what do you teach people in this unique stage of the Christian life? What is really foundational for the Christian life? And that's where it kind of gets started. And then what we know is the Catechism, which is a text. We now have it in this book. In the ACNA, it's called "To Be a Christian," and it's now, that one's over 360 some questions, and it's meant to be a catechism for the 21st century, recognizing that there's particular challenges, there's timeless things that need to be passed on, but there's also particular challenges that we find ourselves in 21st century North America, that previous generations of Anglicans didn't quite deal with in the same way. So what is the way that we need to form Christians in the faith, and what are some of the guides, what are some of the helps and tools that can help us along the way? So that's more or less what a catechism is, but it's rooted in this concept of catechesis, and that's maybe helpful to distinguish the catechism. This is a text, and then catechesis as a practice, a way of instructing people in the faith.
Yeah, definitely. I think, it's interesting we kind of have ways of isolating words, but I hear people talking about being a disciple and Christ commands us to make disciples of all nations, but disciple and discipline. So like a teaching or like a learning or like a trade, it's kind
Yeah,
of
that's right.
they're related concepts. So I think we can underemphasize the kind of discipline element, I guess you could say, of being a Christian, which is like learning a set of teachings. I always think of in the Epistle of Jude where he says, "Hold fast to the faith once delivered to the apostles once for all." That's a thing. It's a set of teachings that we all kind of have to carry on. And it's interesting to think about how what needs to be emphasized in different periods has changed over time. I'm more familiar with, say, some of the like Protestant Reformation era catechisms, Heidelberg Catechism, Catechism of the Council of Trent. Even in the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, there's a catechism. I'd be interested to hear about some of the catechisms before that. You're talking about catechisms in the early church. What they had to emphasize? Because I'm just thinking, in those Protestant Reformation era catechisms, it's all about justification because that was the big controversy at the time. And similar stuff. I think one of the things I like so much about the ACNA catechism was that it is doing the same thing. It's like, okay, well, today people struggle with these issues, so let's talk about those in our catechisms. So how have catechisms kind of developed, from that early church period? What was being emphasized at different periods of time, and what's the history there?
Yeah, it's funny. There's actually there's little evidence that there was really any catechisms written down, and in fact, there's all sorts of, you'll find people in the early church saying, like, don't, the creed, for instance, or the Lord's Prayer, they say, don't write this down. Don't let this get out into the inside. This is only for the faithful. So you're being initiated into the church, the family of God, and this is it mostly in the early church, and I'm talking here kind of 3rd, 4th, 5th century. Mostly the kind of the staples tend to be the baptismal creed, which is similar to what we know as the Apostles' Creed, and the Lord's Prayer. There's always kind of moral instruction that's happening, but it's often more implicit rather than explicit, I might say. You'll find people doing different things, like some evidence that they taught from the book of Proverbs, for instance. Ambrose of Milan in the 4th century gave a whole series of sermons on the Old Testament patriarchs as moral exemplars. And so there's all sorts of ways that the early church is doing moral formation. but they did a little bit less than the Ten Commandments than was done in later Reformation periods. Not to say it's not absent, but it just wasn't the kind of template format that Reformation era catechism used. So yeah, it's interesting that they didn't really have these written catechisms until the late Middle Ages, and there's plenty of that in the pre-Reformation period. There are things like catechisms, and um, they often serve for slightly different purposes. Then by the time you get to the Reformation, there's all sorts of new changes going on with technology, with print media technology, with broader sorts of like trends in education in the early modern period. So there's a whole sort of like educational paradigms that are changing in the Reformation era that the sort of catechetical industry of the Reformation sort of is working alongside of, both in the English church and the what we now call the Anglican Church, but the English-speaking church in the 16th century, as well as in Germany and Geneva and in Rome. I mean, they're all a part of this sort of what historian Carlos Ayer calls a catechetic, or a craze for catechisms in the 16th century.
Yeah. Why do you think there was that kind of a craze? I mean, what were some of the factors at that time that, you talked about technology and just the controversies in general, that led to the renewed importance of catechism?
Yeah, I mean, I think Martin Luther's a great sort of example of somebody who he's going around, 1517, he's nailing the 95 Theses on the door. And then he's going into hiding for several years. And then throughout like the 1520s, he's going around and he's visiting all these churches. And he's just appalled by what he sees. He says, we've got lay people that don't know the basics of the faith, and we have priests that don't know how to teach them. And so he was concerned both for lay formation, but also for pastoral formation. And so he started writing his catechisms, and he has a small and a large catechism. And the smaller one is very simple. It's based on the Ten Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, and the Creed, and usually something about the sacraments. But typically, those Reformation era catechisms had that threefold structure: Creed, Lord's Prayer, Ten Commandments, in varying orders. And that can kind of mean different things. It depends whether you start with the Ten Commandments versus you end with them. There's all sorts of kind of law gospel things that go on there. But the idea was that this is the groundwork, this is the foundation, this is the grammar of the Christian life. And there was this for him this deplorable just ignorance. It's an intellectual ignorance, but it's also a spiritual ignorance, because they're all related. I think this is somewhat before, the sort of eras in which you have this real split between doctrinal knowledge and sort of affective piety. This is still working in an earlier paradigm where there's not quite as much of a big split between the life, what we now call like the head and the heart, or the life of the mind, and the life of faith and life. So he's concerned that this basic level, but widespread for him, the level of just we've lost touch with the essentials of the Christian faith. And for him, that was something you never sort of like actually get beyond. So he was sort of adamant that one remains, he calls it, a child of the catechism. And he would say that with his kids, but he would say it himself every day. He would go through the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, and the Ten Commandments, because there's this sense of being in touch with the sources of the Christian life, are a continual source of renewal. And when you read sort of pre-modern writers, when you read the patristics or medieval theologians, when you read them talk about the Lord's Prayer, like they just don't talk about it in the way that we do. Like, oh, that's rote prayer. We've heard that all before. We say it all the time, and we just recite it. But when they talk about it, it's just this rich sense, rich wellspring of spiritual life. Like the whole gospel is contained in these beautiful few words, and there's just this richness and devotion to these words that I think is really it's really magical. Like there's really something in the way that they approach the essentials of the faith in a way that's just really life-giving.
Yeah, you touched on in there kind of there was at some point a divide between this kind of like heart and mind element of being a devoted Christian, and this is prior to that, I think, with these catechisms. And the idea was your mind will grow, and of course your heart's attached to that. And I think maybe the kind of aversion we have today towards like rote learning or repeating repetition, right? An element of a catechism is you have to memorize the answer when
That's
somebody
right.
asks the question to you. You know, people struggle with that, I think. Could you elaborate a little bit on why you think that that's kind of what your thoughts are on that dichotomy?
Yeah. No, I take a lot of that. I was really impacted by this book by Andrew Louth called "Discerning the Mystery," an essay on the nature of theology. It came out, I think, in the early 1980s or something. And but anyway, it was just one of these books that, everybody has these books that just really hit you right in the face. So Andrew Louth's book is on this, and he talks about this. He calls it a dissociation of sensibility between the intellect and affect, between dogma and aesthetics. He sort of traces that through looks at especially the early modern period, the Enlightenment, especially, but then the sort of response of Romanticism doesn't really address that, but really just sort of continues that divide. And so he ultimately wants to retrieve sort of patristic the liturgy, but in particular the sort of allegorical understanding of Scripture, but within this sort of the sort of larger metaphysical conditions that allowed that allegory to be this devotion, this sort of intellectual but affective devotion that's not pitched against one another. So he traces a sort of larger sort of cultural history of that division, and there's probably, I'm sure there's other works that have extended that or done deeper analyses of that, but I found that to be a really helpful sort of way into understanding how that operates. A lot of it is related to he I think does an especially good job of relating it to the prevalence of method, of the reliance. He talks about the reliance of particularly the scientific method in the modern period. We have this sort of growing distrust of tradition. We feel like the past has lied to us, and so we need to rediscover the truth for ourselves. And absent reliance on tradition, like the only way we can really do that is the use of method. So, if I go through a method and follow a series of steps and get the results, and you do that method as well, and you get the same results, well, then regardless of, your character or your virtue or anything else, regardless of who the person is that's doing this, regardless of the subject, what we have is objective knowledge. And so the implications of that is to remove the agent, to remove the person, to get at trustworthy knowledge, because it's people that are involved in tradition, and the people have lied to us. Tradition has lied to us. And so it's a way of removing the person from the quest for knowledge. And so again, you can see that as the Enlightenment way of of procuring knowledge, to absent the personal, the subject, from the quest for knowledge. And then you see the romantic sort of reaction to that as just the opposite of that. It's making it all about the subject. It's like, well, there's probably it's not really interested in truth, the quest for truth in the same kind of way, but it's very much interested in the person. It's recognizing that there's this profound loss of the human, of the person, of the subject in the Enlightenment. And so it just sort of reacts to that. And so it's so that's where he's getting at the recovery of tradition as this embodied way of knowing. And he compares this to the way that the philosopher Michael Polanyi talks about tacit knowledge. Like there's actually all these ways in which ordinary people, scientists, know things through tradition, through embodied learning, through the reliance on other people, and through the reliance on real flesh and blood people. That's actually always the way we always know things. But he's saying that's what tradition is, and that's what the church has always done, and in terms of sort of helping people know God, helping people to know truth. So it's a very roundabout way of getting at what's at stake there. But I've always found that sort of paradigm helpful for understanding where we are and why we so deeply have inherited that sort of head and heart kind of dichotomies.
Yeah. I think, while you were saying that, I was thinking about how that kind of paradigm explains something that I've always had trouble with, but the kind of weird way that we look at beauty today compared to
Yeah,
maybe previous generations.
yeah,
So like, nobody in the 1600s would have thought, okay, well, everyone finds something beautiful, but that's just kind of a weird coincidence of everyone's opinions, I guess, that everyone finds the Sistine Chapel or whatever beautiful. But today, there's a hesitancy to be able to concede that something might be, objectively beautiful, even if everyone seems to agree, because there's no method that you can put that through. Even if, again, all the subjects, all the people that we, kind of would pass on this kind of collective knowledge about what is beautiful and what's not beautiful. Even though there's a really good reason to trust all those people, because it's not a method that I can write out on a piece of paper. We don't necessarily trust our instincts there. Versus that's not how, like, I think you're making a good point about how the church doesn't work that way. The church uses people. I think people also really struggle with that as well from our modern world. They don't like that the church is full of people, and that
that's
people,
right. That's often people's biggest problem with it. I like
yeah,
who's no one's opposed to salvation and goodness
yeah,
and
yeah,
God. It's all the
exactly.
people that are getting in the way. But
Yeah, it's this
that's of
common
course
life that we actually have to put up with other people, and sometimes they fail us, and sometimes there's a person in authority over us at the church, and that's just too much.
it's too much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but and especially with catechism, because what a catechism is saying is that the subject, the person receiving the catechism, has to be conformed to something objectively true, and that it's
That's
the
right.
job
Yeah.
of this community to impart that objective truth to the subject. So, again, compared to that dichotomy, right? The Enlightenment over here, it's all about the objective and not about the subjective, and the Romantic over here, it's only about the subjective. What the Christian tradition is trying to do is deliver the objective to the subject, and
That's right.
by subjects. And I think that's a crucial thing that the Catechism can do for people today in our modern world.
That's right. And that's exactly why I think it's important to do the kind of some of the larger sort of cultural analysis work to know where we are in our place. Because one of the kind of laments or critiques I often hear of the catechism and say, well, this is just head knowledge. This is just, you're just trying to input knowledge into the people, and that's never going to work. And you're like, well, that's so you're taking this ancient practice and trying to apply it in a modern sort of framework that's this living in this dissociation of sensibility. And yeah, that would probably be problematic to do. But what else? What are you going to do instead? You end up doing just kind of, well, we're just going to do practices or something like that, or we're just going to do help people experience the love of God. And you're like, that's great. Like, what God are you talking about? Um, and so I do think it's helpful to retain the practice. I think this is a sort of trustworthy, time tested. This is a gift of the church, catechesis. But to also be able to help people see the kind of larger, social imaginary in which that practice is taking place is I think worth doing.
Yeah. An example of the kind of catechetical format in the Bible is when people want to say, "Oh, I just follow Jesus." But one of Jesus's questions to his disciples was, "Who do you say that I am?"
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
And you have to be able to answer that question. That's the theological question we have to be able to answer correctly. I mean, there's like all of the wrong answers in Matthew 16, right? They give all the wrong answers, and then Peter gives the right answer, and that's an important part. So, um, I think we have to be able to answer questions. You can't avoid theology. You can't avoid these
That's
questions.
right.
You need to be able to answer them correctly. St. Peter also says, I think not coincidentally, that we have to be able to give a reason for the hope that is within us. We have to be able to
That's
explain.
right. A logos, like we have to
Yeah.
give a reason to give or an apologia, I think he calls it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And that's because these things aren't divisible. Like you can't just sort of say, well, I just have an intellectual apprehension of who Christ is, or I just have an affective one. It's because that sort of dissociation of sensibility is just fundamentally false. It's not the way that the creation is. It's not the way human beings are. And so that paradigm is a false paradigm, but that's the one that we have come to think is largely true in the modern world. And so, yeah, it's absolutely right.
Mhm. So what are some of the things that you talked about the development of catechesis up to the Reformation? Talked about Luther's catechism, or two catechisms, a smaller and larger catechism, and then you know what's the history of the catechism of the Anglican Church or of the Church of England, and how do we kind of get to the place we're at today with the ACNA catechism?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a fascinating giant book about catechesis and catechizing in the Church of England from about the Reformation to roughly the First Great Awakening in the mid 1700s. That's by this historian named Ian Green. It's called The Christian's ABC, and it's like 500 or 600 pages and probably well over $100. But it's just an incredibly detailed account of all the catechisms that were published in that period and all the ways that people talked about catechizing. And he kind of distinguishes there's catechesis that happens in the family, in the schools, and in churches. So, and that's a broader sort of paradigm, but that's that sort of threefold approach to the strategic effort of catechizing. So it would start with the catechizing in the church, and one of the main pastors priest's main duties was catechizing. So usually either adjacent to a Sunday worship service, sometimes it was in the afternoons, or sometime like before or after the service, or he would just go around to people's houses, depending on the town and the neighborhood and all that stuff. So the pastors, this is one of his main duties. And you read about this. One of my favorites, one of the more accessible sort of accounts of the pastor's job of catechizing. There's really good accounts in like Richard Baxter, things like that. But I love George Herbert, because he's just everybody loves Herbert. But he has a great little, couple of pages on the pastor's duty, the country parson's duty of catechizing. It's just wonderful, and you get a sense of that, like what the pastor's task is. But it was also the job of families, of parents to catechize their children. And then it was also the schools. So oftentimes the school, like the grammar books, you're teaching these kids to read, and you're doing so through teaching them the catechism. So they're learning grammar and reading and logic and all this, but they're learning it like they're not just reading, whatever bland stories we have in our textbooks today about, kids going to, you know, Italy so they can, order food at a restaurant or something like that. Like those aren't the examples that they use. Like they're all examples drawn from, Christian teaching. Um, so there's this sort of strategic effort. And with that, I mean, we think of, yes, there's the prayer book catechism, and that's a short catechism. I think it starts being published with the first book of Common Prayer in 1549, and stays on through there. It's appended, comes right before confirmation. So this is seen as preparation for confirmation. It's assuming infant baptism, and it's saying by the time you come of age, you profess the faith on your own, you come to be confirmed. This is what you need to know. It's fairly short. It's still kind of roughly using those threefold tools of creed, prayer, and commandments and sacraments. But then at the same time, so that's the only like official one. There's one by Alexander Knoll in the 1570s that's sort of a semi-official Anglican catechism. But in addition to those, there are several hundred catechisms that are being published in this period. And these range from these really short little rhyming catechisms that's to be used for little kids, all the way up to like multi-volume, multi lectures, like college lectures, university lectures, basically. That would be something like a large catechism. So it's like from wherever people are in the stage of the Christian life, there's a constant sort of return and an expansion. But it's all sort of structured around sort of the catechism. And one of my favorite sort of discoveries was the Anglican priest Thomas Bray. He's one of the founders of the SPCK, one of the still going publication firm. But he promoted these. He was like writing basically to wealthy people in England and the Americas to say, like, you really need to invest in the libraries of your pastors. He's like, we have all these poor country pastors that live on like hardly anything. We need to buy them libraries. We need to get libraries. So I love this guy. He has all these recommendations for like, here's the books you should buy. Here's a list, and they're all organized around the Creed, the Lord's Prayer, the Ten Commandments. So it's all sort of organized. So he's thinking about libraries, like he's thinking about a culture's knowledge organized around the Catechism. So my favorite, he has a book called Bibliotheca Catechetica. It's a real splashy, book. But I think that kind of large scale, you're just thinking about these little rhyming catechisms for kids, but you're also thinking about libraries. So you're just thinking all across this sort of spectrum of knowledge and culture. And the foundation of that is Christian doctrine and practice. Like that's what's organizing a society's sorts of knowledge. So there's tons of actual just catechisms that are being produced in this era, but there's also this larger sort of cultural effort to think about broad scale efforts of catechizing.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I'll
No, you're good. I love to hear you talk. I mean, you're the guest. I'm just the guy that's asking you questions. I was interested to hear that there were so many catechisms being produced.
I know, it's fascinating. I think it's even more. I think I want to say it's like 800.
Wow.
That he found.
Would that have been normal, or is that like
dug up over
Yeah, wow.
probably a 200-year period.
Yeah.
And that's I don't even think that includes stuff that's written in Germany but was republished in England, that sort of thing. So
yeah,
it's wild.
Would that have been a unique element of England? I'm thinking, okay, well, the Presbyterians, they've got the Westminster Catechism, larger and shorter. The Lutherans, they've got their small and large catechism. Was it partially because the BCP catechism was so short that there was this need for larger ones? I know Knoll's catechism is kind of seen in that way.
Yeah, I don't. It very well could be. I think that would be a plausible explanation. Is that because there wasn't like a comprehensive standard, it actually allowed a lot more room for more sort of local creativity, like local particular creativity. And I do suspect that you would have, in Geneva or wherever, like variations on Heidelberg or Westminster or something like that. So you probably have a similar kind of energy around it, but it's more closely tied to these sort of standard catechisms and confessions.
Interesting. Yeah, that's super cool. I didn't even think about, somebody might say, "Okay, I have an idea for catechism," and they'll just kinda do
Yeah.
that in the
Well,
local.
because it is, I think this is one other maybe distinction worth making, in that like a catechism in this context is slightly different than a confession of faith, um, or a creed, right? A confession, like the Westminster Confession of Faith, um, is like, these are the doctrines that you must believe, and like we as a church have sanctioned these things. I mean, whereas a catechism still functions a little bit more like a curriculum, like so there's a little more room for like flexibility and adaptation with a curriculum. So you're saying, well, this is like what I'm seeing is the need for this particular community, while still being faithful to this tradition. It's sort of a little more flexible, a little more adaptive, I think.
And so, given all of that kind of catechetical diversity, I think those Christians might be surprised to come to today and find that that's not how the average Christian community works. We're not doing catechism in school or as much. You don't have a rogue pastor kind of developing his
Yeah.
giant catechetical book and handing it over to his congregation as much. But we still have catechisms, and obviously there's the ACNA catechism that we're talking about today, which I think is super important. So how did kind of all of this historical knowledge and kind of what was the philosophy behind the ACNA catechism as we have it today?
Yeah. Well, it was, yeah, a quite broad scale effort. So one of the sort of luminaries behind the ACNA catechism was J.I. Packer. So now late J.I. Packer was a big champion of catechesis kind of throughout his career. He saw this as his vocation. He understood his vocation. I think at one point he calls himself a Latter-day Catechist. He was like, I'm not a sort of properly like a systematic academic theologian. I'm not really writing for that crowd, but I'm also not like writing, airport level books, something like that. It's like, he understood as kind of doing this sort of something like what a C.S. Lewis was doing, um, writing to really elevate lay people to have a real much deeper conception of their Christian life. So, but yeah, so he was and he's listed on the Catechism as one of the main editors. But the work of writing the Catechism was done by a wonderful team, a really broad team. So my friend Joel Scandrett is listed as, I think he's listed as the executive editor on the Catechism. He was a part of this group, but there was a catechesis task force of, it would vary. People would kind of come in and out, but you can see on the first couple of pages of the Catechism all the people that were involved, either as the main writers or as contributors or as editors. A whole slew of ACNA bishops gave it their oversight. And so this group met. This was the Committee for Catechesis. It started, I think, this is one of the things that at the ACNA's founding, Archbishop Bob Duncan said, we need a prayer book and we need a catechism. And so these were some of the early task force that were created. And sure enough, right, 2019, there's a prayer book, and then the official version of the catechism was published in 2020. And these have become really the standards of the faith, the church's way of praying together and the church's way of believing. Um, and but I guess interestingly, the original catechesis task force wanted to, first they said, well, we should actually develop a catechumenate. And that's a word we haven't talked about, but a catechumenate would be a kind of formal stage or formal process of becoming Christian. And this is something that the early church, again, people look back to the early church as a sort of they see this multi-stage catechumenate. You go from being an inquirer to a catechumen proper to somebody who's preparing for baptism and then the immediately baptized. So they see this process of catechesis is often called the catechumenate. So I think this was actually like the first thing. It's like, well, we need this like formation process. And I think this is all lore. I wasn't around in these days. Um, yeah, but then the bishops came back and said, actually, we actually want a catechism, so please do that. And so they got to work on this massive project, and it took you know several years. And so I think around 2014 or 15, there was a test version of the catechism that was published and circulated widely and used, and they got tons of feedback on that, and revised that into what's now the official catechism that was published in 2020. But the general philosophy of that, of like why a new catechism at all, why not just use prayer book catechism or something like that, is precisely because of the missional context of North American Christianity. It's for a generation of Christians that are really either brand new to the faith, and more so, there's people that in America, North America, that have never encountered the gospel before. At the same time, there's a lot of what we might call cultural Christianity, or those who have grown up in church, or they've gone to kind of Christmas and Easter, and they've been around. They might even consider themselves Christian, but who have never been catechized. They've never encountered the faith. And I think there's a sort of uniquely sort of American kind of context, which is like a real high value in individuality and in authenticity. And so for all the folks that are coming to the Anglican Church, they're both sort of drawn to liturgy and tradition. And then when they actually are confronted with it, they're like, wait, this actually rubs up against my deep love for authenticity. And so you find it's actually explicitly addressed in the catechism. When you come to the sections on the liturgy, that says, are these, rote prayers, these given prayers, like, is that contrasting are these not authentic? So it's got these kind of like ground level questions about how we encounter and experience the Anglican faith that I mean, maybe they've been there for a couple hundred years, that those questions about authenticity and stuff have been really brewing, but they're actually addressed quite explicitly in the catechism. And so that gives opportunity for those who are new to the faith to ask these questions that they have, as well as the age-old questions like, who is Jesus Christ? And what does it mean to say that what even is God? What even, it's the very, very basics that we all need, but I think especially in our current moment, like these are we just so lost touch with traditional Christianity, sort of classical understandings of God, of all this stuff, that the Catechism affords the opportunity for a catechist and catechumen to really dialogue in this together. That's what I've found in my own sort of catechesis at our local church here in Waco, Texas. It's Texas is super Baptist. It's just there's I have a professor who used to say that in Texas there's more Baptists than people. And um, so you have like lots of sort of cultural Christians, but you have the people that are coming to an Anglican church in 21st century Waco, Texas, are those that it's still quite a range. Like, it's a range of people who have grown up in broadly sort of American evangelicalism, looking for deeper roots, looking for deeper tradition, love like the intellectual, the piety, the heart, all the things that one finds in the Anglican Church. But there's the wrestling with these questions about how does this work? How does this Anglican faith really like take hold in my life, and where does it come up with our sort of cultural narratives? And we've Christian or not, we've absorbed so many of the cultural narratives about, authenticity and freedom and, identity and all this stuff that it really hits the road in catechesis at the ground level, at the level of sort of core narrative stuff. Like it all comes together in catechesis. It's a wild time.
Yeah, yeah. I know. It's interesting actually, just reflecting on it. In my life, I was baptized in the ACNA, and so when I became Christian a couple years ago, it was I want to say maybe 4 years ago now. I used the ACNA Catechism for my baptism, and then when I got confirmed, we went through it again. So I've been through it twice now. I'm a product of the ACNA Catechism.
Luther would be so glad, you don't ever outgrow it.
No, and it's very true that even actually at the second reading or the third reading, you go through it, and there's different things you're concerned about, the things you're asking at different stages in your Christian life. What is our view on the sacraments might not be the first question an outsider has who doesn't really understand that much about Christianity coming in. They're going to have questions about who is Jesus, what is salvation, those kinds of things, which the Catechism also answers. But then say you are a Baptist and you're becoming Anglican now. You already know all that stuff about Jesus, but you're like, wait, what do you guys mean when you're talking about the Lord's Supper and all that kind of stuff?
Yes.
What's your view of of confirmation and all those kind of things, which the Catechism also answers, which I think is what makes it super helpful. It's kind of comparable, maybe. It's in one way it's comparable to a larger catechism, but it's also kind of got the accessibility of this kind of a smaller catechism, as we might say in the other traditions.
That's right. And it can be used, and it is being used in lots of different ways. So it is meant to be something that can be used for a brand new Christian. Typically not for children. It's probably like a bit, but the idea was, instead of, because a lot of times in the sort of earlier periods, catechism was really aimed at children, and it's kind of associated with like teaching children, precisely because of confirmation was usually in the kind of early teen years. But it was a recognition that, oh wait, like our adults and our parents aren't well catechized, and so how can they catechize their children if they're not themselves catechized? So I think it was a wise move to sort of start out with this kind of either mid-level or kind of catechism that could be, you can go through it several times, and really, you're learning more and more. But it is something one can use, as in your case, with a new believer preparing for baptism, preparing to enter the Christian faith for the first time.
Yeah. And I think that's what's so helpful, is that it does kind of assume a neutral perspective, whereas older catechisms, for good reason, they assume so much because they were used in majority historic Christian countries, nations, stuff, people that were already immersed in a lot of the stuff and they took for granted, that is not being as taken for granted in some ways today as it
That's
was
right.
then. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, in that context, the catechism is doing like a narrow slice of the catechizing pie.
Yeah.
There's lots of other pies, whereas now there's
Mhm.
not a lot of pie.
No, there's not a lot of pie. It's interesting too, because people. One of the popular topics today too is talk about, okay, well, there are all of these things that secular society in the West takes for granted that they did inherit from Christianity,
Yeah,
and so sometimes an important part is kind of pointing out, okay, actually, you're taking that for granted, but here's the kind of metaphysical justification Christians have for actually thinking that that belief about human dignity and yada 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 is
that's right.
actually true, is
Absolutely.
a
Yeah.
fact. And so I think that can be a huge part of catechesis today, is kind of alerting people to their assumptions as well, and kind of saying, so we're talking about rote prayer before, but like the assumption that a rote prayer is not authentic um, is an assumption that you can kind of say, okay, let's take that from a different perspective. So what were some of the assumptions that kind of people that are involved in the catechism? What are they trying to address and correct and talk about today?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, I think I'm thinking of Tim Keller actually wrote some really great stuff on catechesis in his latter years, right around his church was involved with this thing called the New City Catechism. which was like a more reformed kind of evangelical version of the Westminster, or a more reformed catechism. It's short; it's maybe 52 questions, and um, so they were involved. And it looks, like it's a little more flashy, a little more 21st century um, than 16th century, but same kind of idea. But actually, what he would talk about in some of his other writings, I think it's a book called like Reaching the West Again or something like that. It's a short little book he wrote, but he has a whole chapter on catechesis, um, where he talks about this, what he calls counter catechesis. And so he takes this. This is actually comes from a book that J.I. Packer wrote on catechesis, called Grounded in the Gospel. But he introduced this idea of counter catechesis, and this is like, when Jesus says, "You have heard it said, but I say unto you," and so Tim Keller takes up that rhetoric, and he has like 8 or so different, kind of cultural narratives. And he takes a lot of his stuff from Charles Taylor and other sorts of kind of social theorists who trace the sort of a genealogy of modernity into this, what Charles Taylor calls the secular age. Um, so Tim Keller is quite influenced by that. But his point about the sort of, you've heard it said, but I say unto you. So he takes this and he says, you have heard it said that your identity is whatever you make of it. It's who you are is the most important thing, and nobody else can touch that. But I say unto you, your identity is found in Christ. And you have heard it said that science and progress will eventually lead us to the truth. But I say unto you, um, you know, the truth is found in Jesus Christ. So he goes through and thinks about, so it's things about our world and culture, about these sort of larger questions about creation and who we are. But I think there's a lot of questions. I mean, tons of questions and about human nature and human identity. Like, what are creatures? And so I think that the catechism today has ample opportunity for catechists to really engage like the burning questions that people have, but they come at it asking questions about here, like, what about gender dysphoria or something like that? What does the church teach about that? And you're like, all right, I see your question, and I'm gonna meet you there, but I'm actually going to take this back to the ground level, which is the doctrine of creation. So what is a creature? So it sort of takes the sort of burning questions people have, and it puts them on the sort of ground level floor and says, let's talk about this at the level of a foundation. Let's see what's underlying those kinds of questions, and it is able to address them on that level. Um, so for that reason, it's not like, catechesis isn't very like flashy. Like, there's not a lot of news bite kind of sound bite, things with catechesis. There's not a lot of hot takes going on in catechesis, unless you know what's going on. Like, unless you're actually able to see, oh, what you're doing here and sort of resetting the foundations is actually incredibly radical thing to do, because you're just putting folks on a entirely new playing field. Said, sort of, you've been doing this sort of, whatever it is, the conservative liberal sort of battles up here, but you're both agreeing. It's like, sort of like the Enlightenment and the Romantics. Like, you're both inhabiting this dissociation sensibility, um, but we're going to actually remove from that conversation, and we're going to do this sort of more foundational ground laying work, and that's going to set some radically new terms for how we're thinking about human identity, human nature, creation, everything, sacraments, hierarchy, all these things that we sort of come with not knowing about. And it's like, oh, this is actually all there in the in the creed, in the Lord's Prayer, in the Ten Commandments. There's actually quite a radical vision for human life and goodness and flourishing and everything else.
Yeah. So then, you know, I noticed you mentioned the New City Catechism is 52. I know the Heidelberg Catechism is 52 questions, and that's for every Lord's Day,
Yeah.
or at least it's organized into 52 sections. The ACNA Catechism is bigger than that. How should we kind of approach it? I know that the app has like a daily question that pops up. How do we, take the approach the catechism as in the calendar of time of our lives and get, and digest what it's trying to say to us?
That's really good. There is actually 368 questions in the catechism. And so there's been one or two people that have told me like, "Really? Could you not have done 365?" Like, and as I'm told, they didn't even that like never occurred in the discussion. So, um, but yeah, so no, I think it can be used on a daily basis, and there's been a few dioceses that have done like email, a daily email. There was somebody who did like a daily podcast that would just like have one question in the scripture readings show up every day. And so I think that's a good way to use it sort of on an individual basis, just to like have a sort of constant refresher going on. Um, I think it's sort of standard use would probably be still in a church setting. In in our church, we go through the catechism every year. For it's like our foundations class. Like anybody who comes to church, goes through catechesis, no matter how long you've been a Christian or not. Like it's everybody. This is the front door, and we typically go through the catechism in about 9 or 10 months, roughly the time of a school year. Something like that has worked well for just the rhythm of life here. Some people will do an abbreviated version in like 6 months. They're like doing catechesis in a military context, and like everybody shifts around every 6 months. So they're like, got it narrowed down to 6 months. Some people will do it in 3 years. They'll say just no rush. And, they go through the creed one year, the Lord's Prayer another year, 10 Commandments another year. And so there's not a sort of, you know, a set pattern that one must do, but it revolves around a lot of like what is sort of the church's rhythm of life, and how does this work well. So it's meant to be somewhat adaptable until we have 800 some catechisms that are being published over the next 200 years. Um, until then, this is our sort of standard catechism that's designed to be flexible. And that's because, again, this is not a confession of faith. Um, it's a teaching guide, a teaching curriculum, and it's never meant to replace the relational passing on, the transmissioning, the traditioning of the faith that happens through persons. So it's really meant to be more of a dialogue starter, rather than a sort of dialogue closer. So it's meant to be this something you can have between a catechist and a catechumen to give them some things to dialogue back and forth about. But being in that sort of question and answer mode, it's meant to be just the first two stages of a conversation.
Yeah, definitely. And before we wrap up, you used the word tradition there in a fun way. I think you said traditioning to you. And I think I get what you're getting at, but would you kind of wrap up on the general topic of tradition in the church and the kind of handing off of ideas and just touch on the philosophical underpinnings, I guess, of tradition and how that relates to what we're doing as a church?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, for so many, again, thinking about the North American, more broadly evangelical context, there's a real skepticism about tradition because it's been juxtaposed with, the words of God and the traditions of man, in this sort of dichotomy. But we often miss all of the places in the New Testament that they talk about, receiving what has been passed on. And so what that implies is this economy of gift, that just like in the way that our lives are not our own, but they're a gift of God, so also the faith is something that we don't make, but something that we receive. And so the sort of posture, sort of philosophy of tradition is I think can be understood as a kind of philosophy of gift, and that we've been given an extraordinary gift in Christ, and Christ has entrusted His own life into the hands of others, without sort of forsaking His divinity. He's sort of entrusted His own life to fishermen, and those fishermen have entrusted that life, and they have passed it on. And so the faith that we receive is never something that we just create on our own, or something that we receive, blindly out of the sky. It's something that we receive as part of our bonds of sociality. Like we didn't make ourselves. We were born into a family, and in the same way, we didn't create our own faith, but we received it. We were given it. It's a divine gift, ultimately, but that's not in conflict with the gift of human tradition that's been passed on down through the ages.
Yeah, definitely. I think what the word people tend to take out of when Jesus rebukes, "Oh, you, for the sake of the traditions of men, you have broken the commandments of God." They take the word traditions out there and say that's the bad thing. But I mean, he is highlighting the of men part, like they made it up. It's
Yeah,
not
right. That qualifier is quite significant.
Yeah. Versus right, tradition just means something passed down.
That's right.
Like you're saying. So
Yeah.
good things can be passed down and bad things can be passed down. So
The thing is, from our human language, right? Augustine talks about this really, really beautifully in De Doctrina Christiana. You would never even have the language of the Scripture if it wasn't for the gift of human communication, that we learned from our parents. Who are part of a culture, right? So even more broadly than that, this sort of traditioning, this sort of handing on, this passing down, comes in the very, the possibility of even communicating with another person. I mean, it's extraordinary when you think about it. This is people that think about language, I think, are kind of, can get off into get weird, but like what the sort of wonder of life that we have in language is kind of unbelievable. And so I think of tradition and traditioning as a part of that.
yeah, I'm definitely going to borrow that word traditioning and use it from now on. I think it's a great little way of putting the concept. Thanks so much for coming on. Is there anything else you want to say before, especially to the audience or to people listening, wrap up this idea about catechesis and the ACNA catechism? I think this was a wonderful conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would say certainly get a hold of the catechism. The print version is not too expensive. It's published by Crossway. Very easy to get hold of. Although there's a free version of the PDF. If you just do a quick search for ACNA Catechism, you'll probably find an accessible PDF, within a few seconds. The little hardback version from Crossway is quite lovely. And then the new app that has just come out is also, accessible from wherever you get your app things. I think the catechisapp.com. So the designer of it, a guy named Jeff Gale, and his app company Rethink Me. They did just a marvelous job. He worked really hard to make this a beautiful app, to make it something that was aesthetically and Anglican sort of aesthetically engaging. And it does, there's all sorts of things that one can do with that. There's a note-taking feature. There's the sort of daily, you can access the scripture much more easily through this. It's going to open up all sorts of things. It's going to make translations of the catechism much easier to do, and that's going to have sort of huge implications for global mission. So I'm really thrilled about all that's happened with the catechism itself. But my sort of last plea would be not to undermine that, but to say that let not the catechism ever undermine the practice of catechesis that happens between people, that happens in churches, and but especially to encourage, especially priests and bishops, to see that the teaching of the faith as one of the essential, most life-giving duties that that a clergyman can have, and for lay people to hunger for that. There's so many lay people, especially young Anglicans. One of the reasons they come to the Anglican faith is because they've had such a vacuous sort of intellectual, Christian life, and they come seeking this a robust account, an apologia, a logos of the faith, and let's not deprive them of that. So lay people, encourage your pastors to take up the duty of catechesis if they're not doing so, and just taste and see. Everyone that I've talked to has just been remarkably touched by how powerful a really robust practice of catechesis is in developing a healthy church culture. So that's my parting words.
Yeah, that's great. I think my audience would definitely corroborate your observation that lots of young people are looking for that kind of robust liturgical tradition apologia for Christianity. So again, thanks so much for coming on. I want to say to the audience, if you like this video, actually hit the like button. That helps a lot. Subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell button. You'll get notified every time there's a new video. If you appreciated this talk, you can always support over at younganglican.locals.com. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching, and God bless.